We will delve into the role of human rights in promoting and protecting democracy. Our panelists will explore the challenges and opportunities for strengthening human rights protection and ensuring that the principle of democracy is upheld. Join us for a thought-provoking discussion on the intersection of human rights and democracy. Before, we have a short video for you before moving on to the panel discussion. To moderate the panel discussion, I warmly welcome Namya Gunabardhana. Before that, we'll see the video. Uh, I welcome you all
වෙන mic එකද මම on කරා zoom එක. zoom එක මම on කරා.
I welcome you.
mic එක වෙනස් කරන්න. නෑ zoom එක කවුරුත් නෑ. interpretation ඕගොල්ලෝ එකේ විතරයි mic එක on කරලා තියෙන්නේ.
Sorry for that technical difficulty. I invite Professor Sumanesiri Leonage on stage. So for this panel discussion, we have one panelist joining with us physically today, and we have another panelist joining virtually. We welcome both these panelists, and let me introduce our panel today. Professor Deepika Udagama, Head of Department of Law, University of Peradeniya. She is academically specialized in international human rights law, having received her LLB and LLM from Faculty of Law, University of Colombo. She completed her doctorate in Berkeley School of Law, University of California, in international human rights law. Until recently, she served as the chairperson of the Human Rights Commission, and prior to that, she had also served at the Law Commission of Sri Lanka. We welcome Professor Deepika. She will be joining us through Zoom. Our next panelist, Professor Sumanesiri Leonage, is a co-coordinator of Mark School. He is a retired lecturer in political economy at University of Peradeniya. He taught at University of New England, Armidale. Also a fellow of the Solomon Asch Center for Ethnopolitical Conflict, University of Pennsylvania. He is a columnist in both Sinhala and English languages, and his writings include Intervention in the Devolution Debate and One Step at a Time, Reflection of the Peace Process in Sri Lanka, Sabyattva Rajya, Lenin Visin, and also Pahalamale Deshapalana. We welcome you, sir, for this panel discussion. I will ask the questions. So before moving on to my first question to the panel, as we saw in the video we just watched, there are many rights that we have been guaranteed because we are humans. But how aware are we of those rights? And are we ready to stand up if our rights are being infringed is a question. And also, are we a part of the system that we are eagerly protesting, or we are eagerly talking about changing? Are we unknowingly a part of that system? So to discuss these points, I would like to first pose a question to both our panelists. How do you think, I would first pose the same, it's the same question that I would ask Dr. Deepika, Professor Deepika first. Professor, how do you think human rights and democracy interlink?
Can you hear me?
Are human rights, yes, are human rights and democracy in a state interlinked? If so, how?
Can you hear me?
Yes, Professor.
Okay, well, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. And I once again congratulate you, #Generation, for your various initiatives, for being continually engaged with public issues. We are very encouraged as the older generation, if we were to speak in generational terms. Well, you cannot speak of democracy without human rights. That's a fact. I mean, the very idea of establishing democracy, recognizing the concept of democracy, if you specifically think of liberal democracy, is this idea of people's sovereignty, and using people's sovereign powers. You establish representative democracies through the vote, and you establish a social contract. And that idea of the social contract is very central to this idea of liberal democracy. So one of the, I would say, the major condition attaching to that social contract is the obligation on the part of the government, and I would say the state primarily, and therefore the government, to protect people's inherent rights. So that is the relationship that I see between the idea of democracy, representative democracy, and human rights. But one thing I wish to point out is that today, when we refer to human rights, we refer to human rights purely from the perspective of law. And a lot of people expect me, as a student of law, to say that, yes, whatever is guaranteed in the Constitution, the state is under an obligation to protect. I don't agree with it. Because the idea of human rights, while it's very evolving and fluid, is really political, in my opinion. It's a political concept. So there are rights which are not guaranteed in the law. It's not guaranteed in the Constitution, but yet we demand it. For example, we'd say the right to adequate healthcare or the right to education. They are not, or even the right to life is not guaranteed in our Constitution directly. Gradually, through some instances of judicial interpretation, the right to education has been recognized, and the right to life has been recognized. But I don't think people accept human rights in that manner. I mean, people, demand rights because you have a general sense of what is required to live a dignified life, and you demand it. So this is the intimate relationship that I see between democracy and human rights, that it is very much part of the social contract we forge with our political representatives.
Thank you, Professor Deepika. I would like to pose the same question to Professor Sumanasiri. So how do you see the connection between democracy and human rights?
Right. First, let me thank the organization inviting me for this discussion on democracy and human rights. I have a memory problem, first warning, so don't ask me long questions because I will forget the first part of the question when I'm trying to answer it. That's the program paging. Well, the question is, what are the common linkages between democracy and human rights? I think just we can say democracy and human rights are very much closely linked. That's true. But the point is, both concepts, I question the concept of democracy and the concept of human rights, because these two concepts are discussed within a certain economic framework. So my position is have a better linkage between democracy and human rights. I think we have to look into the concepts of democracy and human rights. Now, for example, to speak of democracy. Because now we can see at least some attempts are taken in order to define democracy and together with redefine the concept of human rights. As Professor Udagama says, we are discussing all these things within the confines of the liberal democracy. Is it sufficient? Do we have to go beyond that? Is there a democracy which is different from the concept of liberal democracy? I think these are the kind of things we have to understand. Now, for example, can this liberal economic system provide full employment for everyone? No, you can't do it. So in that sense, what is the meaning of human rights? Second generation, third generation, saying that each person has a right to employment or something like that. So I think what I'm saying is the whole economic social structure is a kind of, it has become a kind of hindrance to democratic and human rights discourse. So I think first is we have to think about the extant discourse of human rights and democracy.
Thank you, Professor, for that answer. I would, if I summarize the answers of the two panelists thus far, I think we have understood that human rights and democracy is undoubtedly interlinked to each other. However, as Professor Sumanasiri mentioned, we will have to reevaluate how we interpret these concepts and whether these are politically and economically interpreted in our societies. And also it was mentioned by Professor Deepika that these are obligations of the state, whether or not they are being guaranteed under the Constitution. So with that in mind, I would pose another question to Professor Deepika. Professor, how do you see Sri Lanka at this point in time with our political and economic crisis? How do you see the human rights and democracy in Sri Lanka, the principles of democracy and upholding of human rights? How do you see it with the current economic and political crisis that is prevailing in Sri Lanka?
Well, I mean, that's $1 million question, isn't it? I mean, in every sense, I would say, people's rights are being violated. And I think, I would like to say that the economic crisis is a direct result of a crisis relating to governance. So there are, you find governance being quite undemocratic, very authoritarian, and absolutely, I would say, to a very great extent, unrepresentative of the will of the people. Currently, in my opinion, there is no social contract. There's no social contract between the people and the executive. There's no the elected executive, and there's no elected executive as such. Even with Parliament, which was elected in 2020, the social contract that was forged then is now completely has been breached, and there is no social contract. So this, to me, is the main crisis. And, all the other problems that we are facing today, including the economic crisis, is about long-standing issues with governance, where, we've really not had very sensitive democratic governance. I agree that liberal democracy brings in its wake certain, its own crisis. But I think the Aragalaya in particular, that many of you were involved in, perhaps all of you, I thought that was really the social democracy moment, that we saw in a very strong way, demanding that there be social justice and deep democracy. So from that perspective, I see all rights being violated. I mean, we first of all don't have proper representation. And the foundation of governance, according to human rights, has to be the will of the people. So right now, we don't have that. We don't have governance that is based on the will of the people. We don't have, therefore, civil and political rights relating to representation at the, outset, I have to say that, but also freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, right of dissent, protest. Absolutely, that is, is very, very strongly in crisis today. I mean, today, actually, in my opinion, the government is going on, through fear tactics. You see these large, I don't know what to call them, even battalions or whatever of police wearing those gas masks whenever, whether it be the students, the academics, the various other, trade unions, professionals coming forward. It's not permitted. So all those rights, civil and political rights, which are favored, privileged in our constitution, they are violated, in my opinion. People are frightened once again to speak up. Now, just the other day, I think these are very important because you also, had these videos interviewing people. Someone told me he saw this motorcade of some, who would be traditionally called a VIP, just racing through the Galha Junction here near the university. And he said, there were 10 cars accompanying the vehicle of whoever this person was. And he said, it was so immoral just to see that, people's money being spent like this at a time when the country has declared bankruptcy. So I said, why didn't you, show your, dissent by whatever means? And he said, but, now today people are taken in under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. And that has chilled to a very, very great extent, free expression, association, and assembly. There again, you see the national security state re-emerge once again. It has emerged. And then, on the other hand, I mean, serious denial of economic and social rights. Our main fear is about the children who do not get adequate nourishment. Those are the formative years. Children who drop out of school, and that specter is very real. I think in the plantation sector in particular, children are dropping out of school at a very high rate, and it's sure to happen in other areas as well. I mean, it's happening in other areas because parents just can't afford to feed the children in the first place, and also buying books and so on. It's really beyond the means of even I think lower middle class families. So when you look at the current situation, I think all forms of rights are violated across the board. And then you also see a huge gap between the way in which the elite live and the rest of the population lives. I would agree with Professor Lieneke. These are the issues that are always there in a capitalist society. We would have liberal democracy, capitalism. So the Marxian critique comes forward to say that, this is exactly the problem with this system. But today, for us who, want to resolve our human rights, entitlements, and violations of them within a democratic framework, say that it's very difficult simply because we just don't have a social contract to speak of. That's the issue.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Somanasiri, I would like to pose the same question to you, sir.
Well, first on economic crisis. I think this crisis is exaggerated. So the first thing you should do is to make the crisis or right size the crisis. Why do I say so? Now, for example, I don't have exact figures with me at the moment, but if you take, we have whole year data only 2021. 2022 data will be published in April or May when the Central Bank of Sri Lanka report comes. Now, according to which our export earnings is, all our foreign exchange earning is something like $17 billion. And our import expenditure, foreign exchange expenditure, or the total spending is something like $20 billion. So there is a gap of $3 billion in 2021. But when you compare with the 2020, it is much higher because in 2022 it is something like $1.5 billion. Now say we have a $3 billion deficit there, and at the same time, the question that we should ask is there any other way to manage this? Now let us look at the breakdown of expenditure. First, medicine. Because when I get into three-wheeler drivers, I ask about the priority list that they would put. First is medicine. And medicine in 2021, we spent only $800 million. These are rounded figures, not the exact amount, but closer. $800 million. For fuel exports, we spent something like $3.5 billion. For agricultural and industrial inputs, we spent something like $800 million, $8 billion. So when you add all these things, it's something like $12 billion. Now, if you want, I mean, as we import certain food items, so we can say $1 billion food items also, then something like $13-14 billion. So my first argument is, if you really manage the economy well, I mean, there is no big problem as far as our earnings and expenditures are concerned. I think this aspect was not taken into consideration. In fact, I wrote an article questioning the finance minister and the CBSL governor. Just give us this arithmetic, but no answers. So the other point I want to stress is, I think World Financial Integrity, there's an organization in Washington. That organization did a study on 137 countries of the global south. And they studied the period between 2009 and 2018, that is 10-year period. And one of the countries, Sri Lanka. And the report revealed that in this 10 years, 2019 to 2018, there is an outflow of money that is something like $43 billion from Sri Lanka to outside. Our whole debt, the total debt, as far as the government debt is concerned, is only $52 billion. One thing we have to be careful to look at is, and the present president and the finance minister, he presented interim budget in last August, I think. And then he presented another budget in November for 2023. And he never mentioned about this event, although he talked about so much about the crisis and so much about the difficulties and things like that. So that shows the crisis is exaggerated for two reasons, according to me. The reason number one is, in order to keep Sri Lanka within this neoliberal economic structure. So they don't want Sri Lanka to go out of that. That's the first reason. The second one is to keep Sri Lanka within the orbit of this, Samir Amin said, triad. Triad is US, European Union, and Japan. Within that triad, within the influence of that orbit. And triad is reflected or explained in case of Sri Lanka in Quad, US, Japan, Australia, and India. So crisis was exaggerated partly because they wanted to keep Sri Lanka within the orbit of these dominant powers of the country. So the whole idea of the crisis is we cannot control it. We have to go, we have to look for support of other countries, and all these things are exaggerated for political economic reason. So I think that we have to keep in mind when we talk about the crisis. We should not, I'll come to that Deputy Nelson, that it's like this when it comes to the democracy. What do they say? When it comes to democracy, they say we can't spend on that, we can't spend on that, we can't spend on that, because if we have election, because it costs something like 10 billion rupees or something like that. And the next answer that they give, when the professionals ask for a revision of tax system that was introduced last month, what did they say? We can't do that because then we can't go to IMF. There is no other alternative. Who says there is no other alternative? There are so many alternatives that we can adopt, that we can use without going to the IMF. I think going to the IMF will not produce anything as far as the economic crisis is concerned. I mean, I wrote a small book on that, and we can discuss those matters because especially the people want to go Gulf phase, and not only in the Gulf phase, but in other countries as well. We can see, and they raise certain demand, and those demand can be met if we economy and if we change the economic structure. That's why they call system change. It's definitely necessary.
Thank you, Professor. Let me just pose the next question also to Professor Sumanasiri. Professor, from what you mentioned with figures and also taking examples on medicine prices and shortages in Sri Lanka. So these are predominantly violations of human rights, if we so to speak. So, sir, how do you think the citizens of this country can, what role do they have to play to gain their rights and to fight for what they are supposed to get as humans?
Yeah, I think I wish to introduce two concepts. The one is constituted power. I will give a brief definition. Constituted power, and the other one is constituent power. These are the kind of two concepts which I'm trying to use. What is meant by constituted power? Because of my problem, I wrote it down. Constituted power means the existing state framework. I mean, a power which is established through a constitution. That is constitution, or the constituted power is. The second one is what I call constituent power. What is constituent power? Yeah. This is the definition on constituent power. Constituent power refers to the legitimate collective force that human possess to think of something and to produce it without having to derive from or submit to what already exists. So these are the kind what I call constituent power. So I think if I refer to the question you said, I mean, people should act as a constituent power. Because at the moment, when it comes to democracy, when it comes to human rights, what we do is, we are trying to get that from the constituted power. Always we ask, give this, give that, this is constituted power. But when it comes to, I mean, there's a very important, I mean, when it comes to democratic system, you may raise your eyebrows up when I said, I think Venezuela is a very much a democratic country. I have a book. If anybody wants, I think you should read it. Communes and Worker Control in Venezuela. This is written by Dario Assolini. You can get the details later. And in which we can see a different kind of democratic rule is emerging. Now, if you get the, when I talk about Venezuela, I mean, the media image is not very promising. Everybody says it's authoritarian rule, no democracy. But when you come to the ground level, you can see the emergence of new institutions, new organizations that are exercising what I call constituent power. Let me come to the goal phase. Actually, what we saw there is a constituent power. Constituent power by nature is a heterogeneous, not a homogeneous thing. It is a diverse system, diverse power. I mean, here I can refer to the Italian philosopher, which I agree. And he wrote a book with another American professor, Michael Hart. And the book, name of the book is Multitude. Multitude. So multitude represents this constituent power. So I think what people can do, is transform themselves into a constituent power rather than, I mean, you can negotiate with the constituted power, but remember that constituent power should be there, even power is constituted by a new constitution. Here I would like to just give a minute. The July 5th manifesto of the Goldface activist. If you remember that manifesto, I think article number 3, they mention something like People's Council in July 5th manifesto, which has become, I think, historical document, and if we really want to redefine democracy and human rights in Sri Lanka, that should be the point of departure. That should be the starting point. Of course, there are so many flaws, so many lacunas, everything. But I think that is the very important document, and we must base our redefinition of human rights and democracy on the basis of that document.
Thank you, Professor. I would like to take my next question to Professor Deepika. Professor, you also mentioned that the social contract between the state and its citizens is currently breached in Sri Lanka, and also that people are somewhat frightened to fight for their civil and political rights. So what do you think citizens can do or should do to protect their rights and privileges?
Well, I mean, I think there's only just one way, whichever way you analyze it, and that is, civic power has to come to the fore. Even in good times in a democracy, even in deep democracies, I mean, democracies are functioning in a very effective way, a relatively effective way. We call them deep democracies, because citizens are vigilant and citizens are active. So you can't think of a democratic system, where people's rights are protected effectively and people, enjoy a good quality of life without the display of civic power. The problem in Sri Lanka, as I think all of us perhaps recognize, is that we have had major weakness there in terms of, civic consciousness and civic power has been very, very weak in Sri Lanka. And, if you look at a country like India or even Bangladesh, Nepal, particularly if you look at India, I think such a complex society continues with its democratic traditions, with all the ups and downs, challenges to secularism and, all the disparities that are there. Still, I think it's because of the power of social movements. Social movements are absolutely essential. So that would be the constituent power that Professor Liyanage is referring to. So what we saw, in Sri Lanka in 2022, beginning in April, end of March and April onwards, was just that. And that is what is so remarkable about it and exciting, because it was very spontaneous. And then, gradually we saw the ideals being articulated very effectively. And it looks like the younger generation, they have a very, creative ideas and creative ways of articulating the demands and in fact, defining the demands. So I think that's what we require. We need organizational strength as citizens. We do need that. And there's no other way. So we have to think in terms of social movements, not flash in the pan type of things, but things that will be sustained so that, we can really rebuild democratic governance in this country. There's just no other alternative. That is why what you do is very important. Our education system has failed us. However much we keep talking about it, it's not aligned actually with the creation of a democratic society, or a society with a democratic ethos. So we've got to, therefore, in a way, begin afresh to establish many of these systems. I think there was a major critique of the legal system, of the law itself during the Aragalaya, which I welcome very much. It was sorely needed because we were too entrenched in the formal legal system. So I think all these systems have to be revisited because they were based on orthodoxies and we just assumed things that really haven't worked. If indeed the economic crisis is exaggerated and people are suffering to such an extent, this clearly shows, we have a lot of work to do. We have an enormous amount of work to do. Now, even where this taxation system is concerned, still we are not quite sure, why this particular form of taxation. And we are not quite sure whether everybody who should be paying taxes are paying taxes. I'm not sure, for example, whether the president is paying his taxes, whether the prime minister is paying taxes. We are now told that the members of parliament are paying taxes, but we need to be very vigilant. We need to find out, and so there is no other alternative other than civic power. And civic power must come with consciousness, need not be through formal education, but, a general sense about public issues in the country. So we've got to regain that Aragalaya moment. That's absolutely essential, in my opinion. Thank you.
Yes, so what both our panelists have brought to the discussion today is that what is absolutely necessary is the civic engagement, and what you and I do individually and also collectively. So with that note, I open the stage for a couple of questions because we are also running out of time. If there are any questions, you all can direct it to our panelists. If we do not have questions, I would like to end this panel discussion with the note that, as I mentioned above and mentioned previously, and also what the panelists said, that it is our duty as citizens to engage in civic activism to regain the rights that we have lost at the hands of the state, which are our rights. So let's do our part as citizens of this country, which was also the message that hashtag brought to you before this panel discussion with the short video clip that you all watched. Thank you so much, Professor Sumanasiri and Professor Deepika, for joining us virtually as well. We thank you all for listening to this panel discussion. Thank you.